I want to welcome everybody to this session, and I'm really pleased to help moderate this discussion. My name is Tom Woodmansee. I'm a principal advisor with CNA, and I'm also a retired police officer from Madison, Wisconsin. I've been with the body-worn camera program for several years now, and I think it's just a remarkable program. And I've been involved with several meetings, and I really have enjoyed the sessions I've been able to attend so far. Today's discussion that we're going to have for this session is on body-worn camera and how they can enhance investigations in the field and prosecutions. And we have a really excellent panel, and we're going to do a Q&A style. We're going to talk, ask questions, but we really want this to be an interactive discussion as well. And I think a lot of the meeting has been thus far. So one of the best things about this program, as I think you're all seeing, is an opportunity to learn from each other. And that's what we're hoping for with this. But before I go on and have the panel introduce themselves, I just want to see, John, are you on? John Markovic? I didn't see you on the participants yet. Oh, John, good. John, would you mind just a couple words on, since you were heavily involved in actually creating this topic, your thoughts as we start?
Yeah, just to give you background, I think this came up probably several years ago when Tom and I were putting our heads together about creative uses of body-worn cameras. And I think there were two, and this one focuses on the first, that as we've mentioned before, that much of the body-worn camera footage goes unviewed. We're starting to see that agencies are increasingly using it for training or for assessment, sort of a self-learning process. But some agencies have also used it for investigatory purposes, right? So you don't need to focus your attention only on the current body-worn camera video, shortly after you've taken it, but there's a lot of video, body-worn camera video, dashboard camera video, still camera video that might relate to your investigation. So we sort of teased this apart in an article and focused on the use of body-worn camera footage in investigation. So going to past footage, maybe where a suspect was involved in a body-worn camera video and seeing who else might have been at the scene, and those could be leads, investigative leads in the current case. So sort of creative use. The other one that we won't talk about today is just some officers, and I thought Chief Moore really captured this well, is that among young officers, the video is second nature. They video all aspects of their life. So we've seen examples of where officers have used video to sort of narrate what they're doing as they're doing video. So you can imagine that an officer would benefit from explaining why he's approaching a vehicle that he stopped for a traffic violation as he or she is approaching the car, is a way to supplement and narrate the video. So this was all born of that. And I think Tom and I became intrigued by this, and we did put together a paper, probably a little bit too lengthy and detailed, like this introduction. So I'll be quiet now and turn it over to Tom, and I'll send that to you in the chat. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, John. Thanks, John. I think Quinn's going to load that. I send it to him earlier for people's reference. And so what we'll do, we want to jump into the meat of this, obviously. And I'm going to have a little bit more background and some comments, much like John had. But before we do that, let's introduce our panel of experts here. Very fortunate to have them. And let me start with Christian Quinn, who's a retired Fairfax County Police Commander and currently a subject matter expert for us. So, Kristen?
Sure. Thanks, Tom. Good afternoon, all. Christian Quinn, I retired from the Fairfax County, Virginia Police Department in 2021. I spent a little over 24 years there. In 2016, I was promoted to Patrol Bureau Major, and in that seat, got tasked with the procurement process for our body-worn camera program. And while I was doing that as kind of an ancillary task, I laterally moved and became the major over our cyber and forensics bureau. So kind of all things technology, things that yield digital evidence, drone program, ballistic identification, those kind of things. So continued to kind of stay in that tech lane. As I mentioned, retired in 2021 and have been in the consulting world since, and very happy to be working with CNA on the technical and training aspects of body-worn camera programs on behalf of BJA.
Thanks, Christian. Really glad to have you. And next, we'll have Deputy District Attorney from Los Angeles County, Jason Lustig. You're also a subject matter expert and just been fantastic in our program. So go ahead and introduce yourself, please, Jason.
Thanks, Tom. I haven't gotten an evaluation yet, so I'll count that as my first evaluation. Hi, everybody. Really happy to be here and have the opportunity to share some thoughts with you. I've been a deputy DA in LA County for just over 34 years. It's kind of amazing that it's gone on so long, but it's never felt like a job. I've had a number of different assignments. I walked into the wrong meeting in 2015 when LAPD was going to launch their body cameras. And I got nominated to be the body camera point person for the DA's office. So I've been involved with the body camera project since 2015, helped LAPD roll out their program, coordinating with the DA's office, and then a number of agencies after that. And now I've been working with BJA for about the last year and a half. And I saw a couple of my sites online, so I'm happy to see you guys and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Jason. And lastly, Lieutenant Chris Johnson from New Orleans PD. And Lieutenant, thank you again for participating, and your expertise is always valued. So please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lieutenant Chris Johnson. I've been with the New Orleans Police Department for about 15 years now. Came on in 2008, and shortly thereafter, I'd say about 4 years after that, we implemented our body-worn cameras here at NOPD. My past experiences through internal affairs, chief of staff at the Detective Bureau, and currently, right now, I oversee, I'm the commander of the NOPD's 5th District Investigative Unit. And I just wanted to say, it's been a pleasure definitely working on these panels. I've learned a lot as well.
Thanks, Lieutenant. Appreciate it. So just to set the tone again for today's discussion, we're going to have the panel respond to some questions that we have prepared for them, and also want you to chime in either through chat or verbally if you have questions, and also any experiences you have related to the topic. So as John mentioned, the idea behind and the goal behind this session is to really improve and innovate with what we can do with body-worn camera, because as we all know, the original impetus for this was a national push to have more police accountability and transparency, which is good. But what we are seeing and finding as this evolves is that body-worn camera helps in many ways, helps our industry that we were not originally thinking or be aware of. So as I mentioned, I've been part of several of these meetings, and I just love how BJA has set this program up to offer an opportunity, a venue for us to share our experiences and how we can improve. And, you know, we all know with 18,000 police departments around the country, having consistency with training, technology, policy is so challenging. So these venues really help us. We're going to talk about today some of the impacts that body-worn cameras had on investigations, forensic considerations, officer wellness, even legal parts that Jason will talk about with Brady considerations. We've already heard during this meeting about some of the considerations like AI, innovative thoughts, training, procedural justice, even a question that came in yesterday about using BWC for show-ups in the field, which I thought was a really interesting question. So as John mentioned, the article, and I'm not trying to promote the article, but it was the start of what we had this session for. We worked with several sites around the country and had them provide their insights as to how they're using body-worn camera in new and innovative ways to help their investigations. And just a couple, John mentioned narration. One site talked about how they have actually a policy where the officers are to articulate their surroundings, their understandings of the situation, what their decision-making is, obviously within tactical safetyness. Jason's going to comment more about this later, and the importance of not over-narrating from a prosecutor's perspective. We had sites talk about how their evidence collection can be impacted by body-worn camera, especially in environmental issues where the conditions, the integrity of the evidence can be impacted, like footprints melting in snow. Detectives using body-worn camera for their field investigations, which we know and is obvious. One site talked about how their supervisors handle complaints that come in on the phone when they activate their call, where obviously one-party consent is permissible, to more accurately capture the complaint on the phone. Tampa Police Department talked about how cold case investigations, they've reviewed dozens and dozens of hours of body-worn camera footage to help solve some of their homicides that were outstanding, and they had hundreds of them. Rochester Police Department talked about how they would use for their tactics when they were going to execute a search warrant. They would reference the location of the search warrant and review the footage to look about the layout of the dwelling or the residence or wherever they're executing the search warrant to see if there were children present, if there were dogs present, to use it to enhance their tactical capabilities. And one that stood out to me, especially is Wichita and their domestic violence investigations. They would have body-worn camera footage reviewed by advocates following domestic violence incidents where children were exposed to some trauma. And the advocates would look at the footage and determine if follow-up and resources and support were needed to provide to that family and go directly to them, which I think is remarkable. And then civil unrest, we're going to have a session on that tomorrow and the importance of how body-worn camera can play into that. Even things as simple as an officer reported that he would turn on his body-worn camera when he was running radar to capture what was on the screen to support his radar while doing speed enforcement. And then also lastly, officer wellness obviously assists with complaints that come in for potentially speedy processing of the complaints, but also during critical incidents. I think we're seeing that departments are using it not just for training, but for after action reviews to reinforce good decision-making that officers have been making, the actions, capturing the actual chaos of the incident. We all know, a lot of us have been there. During trauma, your memory is impacted and you second guess yourselves. So those are just some examples. And again, we want to hear from you. Okay, but let me now just kick off with our panel. And Christian, I'm going to ask you the first question based upon your experiences. You've had a unique blend of experience related to both body-worn camera and forensic investigations. Can you tell the audience about any real-world examples where BWC has helped enhance your evidentiary outcomes in critical incidents or any other investigations?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tom. There's a couple noteworthy ones for me. First one was it was 4 years ago this month, like 7:30 at night. Officer pulls into a kind of commercial business suites. This is in a densely suburban area, not far from Dulles Airport. And he's just sitting there doing paperwork. And unbeknownst to him, not long before that, two gang members have walked up to the second level of this commercial suite, and they are under a ruse, get into a business, and they are robbing the business. And this business has security cameras that face out at the parking lot. Of course, of the robbery, it's not enough that they get the money. One subject attempts to rape a female employee, and as she's pleading with him not to, she points to the video monitor of the parking lot and says, "Look, the police are here." And they look at the monitor and realize there's a cruiser out front and figure maybe it's a response for them. So they run out and kind of actually almost run across the front of his car as they're running away. And then, of course, the victims from the business come out and they're shouting to the officer. So he's in a position where he's a single officer cruiser where he's literally going 0 to 100. He's sitting there doing paperwork, and now he's in the midst of a robbery, attempt rape, an event that turns into a carjacking and OIS. So he gives chase to the two suspects, bails out of the car. They're running literally across the lot down the street, and the suspects start splitting up. Well, one of the suspects that he is focused on turns and begins just randomly firing back over his shoulder with a pistol. Officers returning fire, neither are hit. Officer loses sight of the second suspect, kind of takes some cover. Other suspect that was firing at him crests a corner. The short version of this is that subject's apprehended not much long after that, a distance away. The other subject actually runs to a commercial location about 3/4 of a mile away. He makes it that far and does a carjacking that gets botched and is failed, and he ends up getting arrested in that area. So really sprawling scene, lots going on, high stakes, officer involved shooting, community really put at risk during this significant crime scene. And forensically, a couple things that come to mind right away. This stuck out for me because it was my first investigative command where we had an OIS and body-worn camera was involved. I had been on OISs before as an investigator, but never one where we had the benefit of BWC. So nobody's hit, but we're trying to piece together, where did all those projectiles go? Where are cartridge casings? Where are they supposed to be? Officer gives some initial information. And what is notable was that the body-worn camera really helped us with some of those explainable gaps attributable to the officer's tunnel vision at the time of the event. At the height of the incident, when he's saying, Well, I was in the intersection shooting back. Well, as it turned out, we didn't find cartridge casings in the intersection. In fact, I don't know that we found any on the pavement. He guesstimated how many rounds he fired. And I would not rely on the audio in a BWC footage to determine rounds fired, but it was helpful in this instance. But where it was most helpful was, where was he as he was firing? And we knew from the footage, he was actually in the grass, which was very understandable because he's just, all his executive function is going to staying alive, and he's moving laterally. He's not still running toward the subject. So most of his cartridge casings were not in the middle of the road like he thought they were. A couple other things that come up out of that event from an administrative and tactical standpoint is the footage wasn't viewable in the field. So we actually had to move to another location to download the video first, or really probably more accurately upload it, view it on desktops at one of the districts there. And I remember that being a bit of a challenge because the investigators on scene had no access to that footage. So we're literally relaying, what we're seeing on the video to them in the field over the phone, or quick chirps over the radio. So that was a notable thing. But the other advantage we had in general with cases that have BWCs, you're seeing the officer approach the event, and you're seeing the scene as pristine as it gets. When you think about instances where someone's been injured or harmed, you've got officers might render aid, they might perform CPR, rescue comes in, EMTs, they're moving furniture, they're doing things, and things just in the scene end up out of place and sometimes unexplainable. Sometimes that's pertinent, sometimes it's not. But the advantage of BWC footage is you can go back and see what did that scene look like when the first officer got there. The second case I want to highlight really quickly was more critical incident than anything else. 2016, we had a gentleman with significant cognitive disabilities wander away from a group outing, and he was stopped by officers on the street. At the time, we did not have BWC. We had in-car video. Officer gets out, engages him. As it happens, it's a spring day, but it's a really, really hot day. And he had walked probably over a mile, this individual. And they end up holding on to him because he's trying to walk out into traffic. He ends up having a cardiac event and unfortunately dies. They attempted to perform CPR. They attempted other intervention. So I mention that because that took months to determine that was actually accidental, that there was no culpability on the officer's part. And this is only like a year after the Freddie Gray incident, which is only 37 miles from where I worked. We had another case a few months after our body-worn cameras pilot program was stood up. Similar, person having a manic episode, person using drugs, and officers end up working with him in his home to try to de-escalate that. He ends up is throwing things, he's screaming, he's flopping around on the floor. They end up subduing him, cuffing him. He has a medical emergency and he dies. And in that case, those officers were cleared within a month, and that footage was released to the community to assuage those concerns and really show what did that look like. And I've often in my mind contrasted the similarity of those two incidents and the ease with which that was both explained to the community and the ease with which those officers were cleared of wrongdoing. And I attribute that entirely to the body-worn camera being on scene. And there were issues with releasing the footage. The subject in that case was nude. It was a rather graphic, really inflammatory video. It's a person suffering a drug overdose who dies. But ultimately, they did redact it. We scrubbed certain things and kept things out of it for not so much evidentiary aspects, but more to make it suitable for public release. So those are probably the biggest ones that come to mind with respect to the importance of BWC as a device to enhance evidence as well as contribute to transparency and accountability.
Great, Christian. And Chief Gaynor threw a question out to you. The officers involved, were they permitted to review video before they gave their statements or after?
In the OIS, I don't believe that officer reviewed them before they gave the statement, but they also didn't collect a comprehensive statement that night. They just did a quick walkthrough on scene, and then they did do an interview on clean memory, if you will, like a day later, and then showed the officer the footage and then walked them through it again to fill in final gaps. And I know that's probably too long for our presentation, but a lot of different opinions on that, a lot of good points on both sides with respect to getting it accurate, getting it right, and the best methodology to do that.
Great. Thanks, Christian. Thanks, Chief, for the question. So Let's move on to Jason and Lieutenant Johnson. I'll start with Jason, and this is a broad question, but just with your expertise, tell us about how you've seen the benefits of body-worn camera grow as it relates to investigations and successful prosecutions.
So there's no doubt that once you put the body cameras out in the field, officers and detectives are going to find extra creative ways to use them. So for instance, we've had agencies that just wanted to deploy cameras to people in uniform. But then the detectives wind up commandeering those cameras when they go do a search warrant and they're wearing plain clothes to do search warrants. They'll use the cameras to document the entries and the evidence recovery. Detectives, again, in plain clothes, will use them when they need to do interviews of victims in the field and they're not doing it in an interview room. Patrol officers start to use the cameras to record playback from proprietary surveillance systems that they can't figure out how to download to recover the evidence. So the officer will use the camera to do that. So I think, BJA really stresses developing a strong policy for your body cameras. And those considerations should be put in there. Is it only going to be uniformed officers, or are you going to allow detectives to use them? So this way you don't have your staff going out on their own and kind of reinventing the wheel. And I'll give you one extreme example. When the LA Sheriff's Department were piloting their cameras in 2015, they were doing it up in Lancaster, which is like a desert rural area north of downtown, way north of downtown LA. And these deputies who were piloting the cameras went out on a call to a homeowner who thought that a bear had crawled underneath their house. So one of these deputies figured out how to jury rig a body camera to a broom handle and used it to stick under the house to see if they could see the bear in the house. So I guess a little bit of an extreme example, but the idea is that, try to foresee how the cameras are going to be used and either authorize or don't authorize the cameras to be used in all these different ways.
Yeah, the bear example reminds me of an agency. It was a large agency. I think it might have been Baltimore, but I'm not completely sure, where they talked about how the officers had used the live streaming capability and removed the camera and put it in a tactical position on an area where homicide suspects were coming and going. So I appreciate that. Lieutenant Johnson, I think just since you've been involved with body-worn camera for a long time and your agency has a great reputation for being progressive in how it is used, can you talk about the evolution of your program in New Orleans and any positive outcomes that you're seeing that you want the group to know?
So definitely when we first got it, obviously it was more along the lines of the police legitimacy, transparency type thing as it relates to, public relations. One of the great things that had came out from that is obviously when people know they're on camera, your internal affairs complaints go down and you're able to disprove a lot of things that really the officer really couldn't disprove, prove any way otherwise, just based upon their statement versus, some complainant's statement. And that really, obviously a lot of the officers were very apprehensive at first because, it's going to be used against me and all this other stuff. But and the real aspect and what was learned is that, just like we all know in the law enforcement community, is that most officers are doing what they're supposed to be doing anyway, right? And then they started to learn the investigative advantages of, I interviewed this witness and I thought that they said this, but I actually missed them saying this, that, and the other that led to this other lead that I was able to help them solve a case. The first of our officers that arrive on scene, and when it all is all chaotic and everything's going on, where this piece of evidence was, or a license plate on a car that was on the scene that they really didn't identify, or was when they were chaos at the scene setting up a perimeter that actually wasn't included, but they were able to research that, which led to another a lead. There's just so many different ways that over the last, I would say a little bit over a decade, that the officers have become innovative, the detectives have become innovative in using this thing for everything else. I'll give you a real quick story that we actually just had in the 5th District a couple of weeks ago, where the subject comes out as a shooting, and we're listening to the guy give his statement and everything else, right? He's got a gunshot wound to the left leg, entry wound into the left top part of his thigh, exit wound on the bottom part of his left leg. and he's giving his story on what happened. He obviously does this. He says, well, my bike's this. So we actually start listening to all these different things and watching the video. And then we see that the guy's bike wasn't where it was. He says this. And then when we go to the hospital to actually interview him, we brought the camera with us and he admitted, right? So it's not just us, oh, well, they're just trying to, not take a shoot in case. It's this guy actually admits that, hey, we brought up the inconsistencies in the interview with him. And he admits that, yes, I had a gun in my waistband and it was a self-inflicted gunshot wound, not that somebody had actually assaulted him in some type of manner. That's just one type of way, obviously. But the biggest thing that we found over time is a lot of domestic violence cases, the demeanor of victims at the time when they later on, when, they don't want to prosecute. And it's like, well, hey, you saying this, but you really felt like this, and other things going on. Children, there were no children present. They got children leaving the house as the officers are walking up that the officers really weren't focused on at the time. There's just so many things that get added into it, and the more officers that have it as well, it's kind of creates that 360 view too of things that are going on. While the video obviously doesn't say the whole story, a lot of times you get different perspectives from where the camera's being pointed. It's just been a great asset, and how it's evolved is gone from just a simply, I guess, like a internal affairs type, how are we going to use this to increase our, public trust, to the investigation portion.
Yeah, Chris, and I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the initial implementation, there were some challenges like most agencies have with compliance. And you had to have some New Orleans had to have some strict compliance policy reminders. It sounds like that's no longer even close to an issue, and that the department, it's a big department, has embraced it universally and seen the benefits. So is that a fair assessment?
Oh, most definitely. Like I said, the apprehensiveness, right? Officers will say, well, I didn't know, because the way the policy was written was upon that interaction. Well, obviously, when you're getting the call for service, you know that you're going to be heading into a situation. So over time, we kind of eliminated those excuses on it, right? And then showed the benefit. And I think that was just part of the creating the buy-in as an organization, to showing that, hey, this is a tool for you, right? To show everything that you did to kind of further into what you've shown. And now it's really just a non-issue. Officers actually are very apprehensive to go on scenes or conduct interviews with people without using them, because they see such a great advantage in it.
Thanks, Lieutenant. And see, a comment came in from Brian, whose last name is worse than mine. I'm not going to try and pronounce it. Who's from Nashua, which I probably didn't pronounce, New Hampshire. Brian, you commented that your officers record residents' ring footage showed a homicide, which was invaluable. I see people can see it in the chat, but that's the kind of information that we really appreciate coming forward with. And please keep it coming, audience. That's what we're hoping for. Christian, I'm going to throw back to you. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in to confirm what Lieutenant Johnson just mentioned about buy-in by the police department. I heard just a few days ago, by coincidence, by chance, I was having a discussion with the president of a police union of one of the larger agencies out here in LA County. And he was telling me about how morale is terrible. They're losing officers. They can't hire. And, things are really not looking good. And they're kind of the worst this person's ever seen it in the history of the department. And I just threw out there, I said, hey, does it have anything to do with them having to wear body cameras all the time and feeling like they're being scrutinized? And this union president was like a deer in the headlights. He's like, no, that has nothing to do with it at all. He goes, they love the cameras. They feel like it's covering their butts. So very interesting to get that kind of confirmation that, once they get deployed, the troops really buy into it.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And the one I mentioned in my opening comments about how we, learn from each other with all the departments around the country, that was something that we faced, that we actually did some focus on with buy-in from officers' perspectives. We had union people talk. I think you can find that in the toolkit as well. And it is still surprising. I mean, maybe it should be surprising that some of the agencies that are still starting off with body-worn camera right now are facing very similar apprehensions from the line officers, but that's changing quickly, I think, now. So and I know we've heard this in other sessions, but that's an important thing to note. So Christian, this is something that's, I think, important to most everyone here is, as I mentioned earlier about how body worn camera had kind of a sense of defending or justifying police actions. Talk about how agencies can enhance messaging to the public about the positive work that officers perform while still being cognizant that the footage is obviously of evidentiary value. But that's really important. And I'm going to expand on the question to you, Christian. Even internally, I think we can do more with promoting the good work internally to reinforce good policing. So go ahead.
Yeah, and I'll share with you that we didn't have this down when our program first started. The way we did our program was kind of that crawl, walk, run, where we started with a 6-month pilot. We only outfitted a portion of 3 of our district stations. So I remember the first night we trained up the very first squad getting these. And our practice was you get trained up and you go out and you have a little grace period where if you're making mistakes with it, it's fine. But otherwise, there's a certain drop dead date that you've got to be getting this right. So everybody's hitting the street with them for the first time. They're using them. I'm driving home. We were training a blend of evening officers, midnight officers, and bike officers. So I'm headed home. It's probably 11 something at night. And the tones go out for a stabbing that had just occurred. And I'm looking at the CAD event, and I'm now on the other side of the county, and I'm seeing at least 22 units. This is a rather complicated stabbing with multiple people involved. And I'm seeing 22 units on this thing total that are wearing body worn cameras, in addition to like canines and stuff that hadn't gotten them yet. And I'm thinking, man, that we just did this, and that is going to be a lot of footage on the very first moment we have these cameras. But the next day when I came into the office and I boot up my desktop the first time, and I'm looking at the footage and I'm looking at the synced views and stuff like that. And obviously I've been a police officer for a long time at this point, but I'm watching it, and it wasn't so much like the grainy walk into the scene stuff. It was they're dealing with one of the victims in an apartment, and it was just so visceral because this guy stabbed, which is much more graphic than a gunshot wound. And they are doing life-saving interventions while they're just dutifully going about their business, offering reassurances like, hey, you're not going to die, you're going to be all right, this, that, and the other thing. And just extraordinary life-saving efforts. And the guy actually did live. So you're looking at that footage through a lens of, this is evidence in this case, because he's making statements and utterances related to the crime itself. The scene is in part in the video, but it's also remarkable to showcase the good work and the humanity of our people. And I don't think at that time we knew how to do that. And I think one thing that, and you hear this theme over and over again, and we ultimately, and I say that looking back because we ended up having to go to the prosecutor and say, hey, we want to do this. We want to put some of this out. And the prosecutors at that point, they were no further along than us. So they're like, no, don't put out anything that's evidence. So our media relations folks, our agency leadership, and the prosecutor's office really wasn't quite on the same page, found a compromise, did release some stuff to the media, ended up being received really well, didn't compromise anything in the investigation. But the one theme I'll say from all the meetings the past couple of days is to have all these stakeholders in the room early and to be having these conversations way in advance as to how these things are handled. Because not that there's always a right and wrong way of doing it, but if everybody's kind of on the same page with what the overarching objectives are, and the thing is, everybody's right. The prosecutor's right, because we've got to get a conviction in court. That's the business that we're in. The executives are right, because we've got to do something to enhance legitimacy and trust within the community and show the humanity of our workforce. And media relations is right, because we've got to control that narrative, and we've got to do our part to tell the story of where there's a public appetite to want to know what was going on out there. So I think the one piece of advice I would give is have all of those stakeholders tabletop these type of things. At the very least, have a dialogue on, hey, what is our stance on these things with respect to not trying cases in the media, but leveraging footage where we can to do right by the agency and by our officers to showcase some of these things. Because again, it's evidence. And I mentioned that case. It was another one where that was one of the ones that from a crime scene standpoint, you saw all kinds of things introduced to the scene. You had furniture get moved. And, I can recall like on shootings where officers come in and the first thing they do is maybe render a weapon safe and move it away from the subject or pick up a weapon or those kind of things. I mean, those are substantially changing the crime scene. But the fact that, I like to say again that the scene is never so pristine from an evidentiary standpoint as when the first of the first responders physically gets there. But that person is usually not thinking, I can tell you none of those officers that were trying to save that guy were thinking about where's the blood, where's the clothes we just cut off, where's where was he laying when we got here, because they're just thinking about life-saving measures, doing the right thing, preserving the scene, apprehending the subjects responsible. And I think the BWCs really do help them take notes and preserve evidence, if you will, without making a cognizant effort to necessarily focus on that.
You use the word humanity, which I really appreciate. And I firmly have come to believe that body-worn camera can be a mechanism to potentially instill empathy from the public on what officers go through, the decision-making, the actions they make, the behaviors that they witness. The word de-escalation is big time used right now in use of force, and footage on body-worn camera, to the point of this question, if it results in deadly force, that will make news, that will make attention. But if there are incidents where justifiably deadly force wasn't used and it was de-escalated, that won't necessarily be put out. And so it does take some proactive effort on behalf of the department's energy, time, and with all the resource and staffing limitations, I would just advocate highly that any opportunity put out good work that you make every effort to. So thanks, Christian.
And I think even from a recruiting standpoint, showing the part of the job that's not necessarily 100 miles an hour or contentious and that sort of thing, some of the benign activity that officers get involved in that actually make for funny stories where they're trying to like wrangle a possum or just the oddball calls for service. Like we think of that as just a goofy call that, somebody went on and it's neither here nor there. You might hear about it through the grapevine. But sometimes when that's on video, those are the kind of things that go viral and show your people in a good light. So I think we have to sometimes be our own best friends in that regard and think about some of this through a lens that is maybe not necessarily the primary criminal justice mission, but just showcasing the profession in a positive way and specifically showcasing our own agencies in a good light.
Great. Thank you. Jason, in the past, you've talked about, use the term disclaimer. Can you talk about that with this group, what you're referring to?
Sure. It all starts with the concept that inconsistent statements are prosecutors' worst enemy. And so when police officers are writing their police reports and they might make statements in the report that look inconsistent with the video, whether because they slightly misremember it or whatever, the defense is going to use that as an inconsistent statement, play the video, compare it to the report. So I always thought that including in police reports some sort of disclaimer that says something like, I'm summarizing the events here. More details can be found on the body camera. Any perceived inconsistency between this report and the body camera, refer to the body camera, that kind of thing. Just an acknowledgement that there could be inconsistencies. They're clearly innocent inconsistencies, to take any sting of an inconsistent statement away from the defense when the case goes to trial. And it's a similar thought of when people are talking about narrating the body camera videos, those are creating additional statements of the officer that could be inconsistent with what the camera is catching, because people misspeak all the time. I do it left and right when there's no pressure on these kind of meetings. So you can imagine an officer has pressure in the field, has to worry about his weapons and who else is arriving, and at the same time is being asked to narrate. You're going to have people that misstate. So, you should be cognizant of how often you want people to narrate, how much you want to push that, because you're going to wind up adding inconsistent statements to the equation. And then when you have inconsistent statements made by an officer, you have the whole Brady function now, that prosecution offices are collecting instances when police officers commit some kind of arguable misconduct that could be used to impeach their testimony in future cases. So I would just say, with the whole idea of narrating and also when you're writing reports, have that in mind. You don't want to add to more potential inconsistent statements if you can avoid it. So yeah, so that's what I was thinking about on that. And then while I have the floor, I was thinking about if you really want to enhance field investigations or help enhance, everything that the police do in the field is great, but it's got to get into the hands of the prosecutor in a usable form, right? So believe it or not, for instance, in LA County, we can have multiple shootings in a particular area on different days over a couple of weeks. And you can have a DA that has multiple of these cases on their desk. If they're looking through a flood of videos on evidence.com or whatever it might be, and they can't figure out which ones the important videos are, and there's 15 videos, when they get to court, they might offer to get rid of the case for 2 years in state prison rather than rolling up their sleeves and fighting it because they haven't been directed to the important videos. So what I'm saying is feed your information to prosecutors in a very usable, friendly format if possible. So if there are particular videos that you want to highlight, make sure you get that to the prosecutor's attention, either using the software in the system, using notes, in the system, or calling and emailing the prosecutor's office, because it is daunting when you have a big prosecution agency with a lot of cases to open up an evidence.com folder with 20 videos. Really, it's just overwhelming. So that's the back end of enhancing field investigations, is give it to the prosecutor in a user-friendly way.
Okay, I want to ask you a follow-up. So just a couple of weeks ago, I had an agency and was working with them on their body-worn camera policy, and they're implementing a policy that they believe is after model practices where the officers will be mandated by policy to narrate everything within their capacity that doesn't compromise safety and tactics. And I talked to them from my opinion that's risky to some degree, and that they may end up actually officers believing this substitutes for their report writing. But can you briefly touch on what you would recommend for departments training the narration in best practice?
Sure. So I think first you want to make sure that the narrations that you're mandating are going to be admissible in court down the road, because technically those statements are hearsay. They're out-of-court statements offered to prove the truth. In California, they're admissible because we have an exception to the hearsay rule called contemporaneous statements. So that's how they can come into evidence in California. But if you're in another state, you want to make sure first, before you go through all the effort of mandating narration, that you're actually going to be able to use it in court. So even if you can't use it in court, it has value, of course, to explain what's going on. But the more statements people are forced to make, the more misstatements they're going to make. And we know, I'm sure any experienced police officer listening has been on the witness stand and they have made an innocent, inconsistent statement in their report, and a defense attorney will have them sweating under the collar on the witness stand for 45 minutes cross-examining them about an inconsistent statement. I mean, I spoke to a county civil attorney that was defending the police department in a civil lawsuit. And the whole issue in the case, the defense or the plaintiff managed to focus attention on. The officer said that he ran around the rear of his patrol car to chase the suspect, but the video showed him running around the front of the police car. And that became the issue in the case. So again, I can't emphasize enough that when you're a prosecutor in court or a defense attorney defending a city against lawsuits, inconsistent statements are the criminal defense attorneys and civil plaintiffs' best friend.
Thank you, Jason. I appreciate it. So we just have a couple minutes left. I have additional questions for the panel, but I'm going to open it up to the group right now. I know you can chat, obviously, but any questions that you have, and then I'd like John to just wrap up. Anybody have any questions? Just go ahead and chime in if you do, or examples from your own agencies where you've used BWC to enhance your field investigations. Okay, we've left our contact information, and obviously this is a topic that we want to continue with because we're getting new and different ideas constantly. So really appreciate the time. I want to thank the panel I know this is hard to pack this much information into 50 minutes, and we could go on with other examples, obviously. But John, I want to adhere to our time constraints. So any thoughts on the discussion or anything that we didn't cover from what you'd like to mention?
I think you covered a lot, and there were a lot of intercepting topics there. I think Jason brings up the good point about, even though very few cases go to trial, what a defense attorney is going to do with inconsistencies is vitally important and could make or break a case, or the reputation of an officer that goes on beyond the case. So that's one of the things we're grappling with. I think we alluded to it in the PERF presentation with Martin Bartness. One of the things that's being considered now within DOJ is what's the, not sort of related to evidence so much, but what the position should be, the pros and cons of officers viewing their own body-worn camera footage before writing a report in the event of a critical incident. And I think one of the issues that many experts agree on is that inconsistencies are inevitable. They're innocent mistakes. I think Jason used the term misremembering. Those recognitions are noteworthy. When it does come to court, it's going to be the ruthless defense attorney who's going to try to exploit those situations. And that's just a tough nut to crack that we have to grapple with. I don't know. I don't have any easy answers, but I thought it was a very important point to bring out. I think that's one of the things we're grappling with. Agencies are moving in that direction. And I think we see more policies with good reason why officers, including Graham versus Connor considerations, why officers should give a perceptual account and then back that up. I like Jason's notation that it may be standard in reports to say, this is what was based on the perception. There may be other information that was revealed by body-worn cameras that provide a fuller, different context that, I think we should explore that as maybe a best practice down the line, or at least kick it around and see if it can get somewhere, because I think those are important considerations. I want to keep to the timeline that you promised to keep, Tom. So thanks for a great session.